A hot summer evening in a quiet bar. The kind of place where folks gather to unwind after a long day, sharing stories and laughter, a cold drink in hand. The lights are dim, the air thick with the smell of beer and aged wood. A few heads turn as a police officer, young and arrogant, strides into the bar. His uniform is pressed to perfection, his eyes scanning the room with a look of entitlement, almost like he owns the place. His gaze finally lands on an older man sitting alone at the counter, a beer in front of him, his posture dignified, but weathered. There's something about him, his silence, his stillness, that catches the officer's attention, sparking an instinctive need to assert power. With a smirk, the officer steps closer, loudly enough for everyone around to hear. "Well, look who we have here." An old vet clinging to his past glory, he sneers, his voice dripping with mockery. The man remains still, unflinching, but his grip on the glass tightens ever so slightly. He doesn't meet the officer's gaze, his eyes fixed on the worn bar counter, as though ignoring the presence standing over him. The officer's smirk grows, sensing an opportunity. "Did they even give you a medal, old man? Or was it just a waste of taxpayer dollars sending someone like you out there?" The words are sharp, cutting through the quiet murmur of the bar. A few patrons shift uncomfortably in their seats, but no one dares to interfere. Some lower their gazes, pretending not to hear, while others watch with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, wondering how far this might go. The veteran finally raises his eyes, meeting the officer's stare with a quiet intensity that silences the room even further. There's no anger, no visible reaction, just a calm that seems to unnerve the officer, his smug grin faltering for a split second. "I serve my country. What about you?" The voice is steady, but firm, a statement of fact, not pride. But the officer chuckles, scoffing at the response. "Oh, I serve my country every day, old man," he says, tapping his badge with a twisted smile. "Difference is, I actually make a difference." The veteran turns his gaze back to his drink, dismissing the officer's taunts with a quiet patience that only comes from years of facing down real threats, far more dangerous than this. But his silence only fuels the officer's frustration, the young man determined to get a reaction. "You think you're better than me? Hiding behind that old, pathetic uniform from years ago? You're just another washed-up vet who thinks he deserves respect." The officer's voice grows louder, the tension in the room thickening as his words cut deeper. People begin to shift in their seats, glancing at one another with uncomfortable looks, but no one moves. No one dares speak up. Then, almost as if he's come to a decision, the officer grabs a beer bottle from the bar and holds it in his hand, giving it a thoughtful twirl. The glint in his eyes is malicious, the intent behind his actions unmistakable. "What do you say we take this outside?" he asks, his tone mocking, as he tilts the bottle, as though daring the veteran to make a move. The silence that follows is oppressive, heavy with unspoken fear and anticipation. But the veteran doesn't budge. He doesn't flinch. Instead, he looks up, his eyes meeting the officer's with a quiet, almost unsettling calm. The bartender holds his breath, the patrons watching with wide eyes, too afraid to look away, yet too horrified to intervene. The officer's smirk fades slightly, sensing the unwavering resolve in the old man's gaze, a gaze that holds decades of experience, courage, and a strength that he cannot comprehend. Frustrated, the officer lifts the bottle, ready to bring it down in a brutal show of power. But as he swings, something astonishing happens. In one swift, practiced move, the veteran sidesteps the attack with an agility that stuns everyone in the room. The officer, thrown off balance, stumbles, his grip on the bottle loosening as he nearly falls forward. He manages to steady himself, but the look on his face is one of shock and disbelief, as though he's just been confronted with a reality he never anticipated. But the veteran's response is not one of anger. He doesn't raise a fist, doesn't retaliate physically. Instead, he reaches for something in his pocket, a small, unassuming phone. The officer watches, his expression a mix of confusion and irritation, as the veteran makes a calm, quick call. His voice, low and steady, carries across the room as he speaks a few words into the phone, words that no one can quite make out. But there's a certainty, a confidence in his tone that sends a chill down the officer's spine. Within minutes, the sound of approaching sirens fills the air, drawing nearer to the bar. The officer's face pales, his bravado slipping as he realizes that this is not going the way he had planned. The patrons in the bar exchange glances, a sense of bewildered curiosity growing as they watch the scene unfold, trying to make sense of what just happened. The officer, still trying to regain control, scoffs, attempting to brush off the situation with forced laughter. "Think you can intimidate me with some friends in high places, old man?" He sneers, though his voice betrays a hint of unease. But the veteran remains silent, his gaze fixed on the officer with that same quiet intensity, a knowing look that speaks volumes. The sirens grow louder, and moments later, several uniformed officers enter the bar, their expressions unreadable as they approach. The officer stiffens, a flicker of fear flashing across his face as he realizes that these are not ordinary officers. These are higher-ranking officials, men and women with authority that far exceeds his own. They stop just short of him, glancing at the veteran, who nods in quiet acknowledgement. The lead officer steps forward, his voice calm, but firm as he addresses the young officer. "We need to have a word with you. Outside. Now." The bar is silent, every eye on the young officer as he stands there, frozen in place, his arrogance dissolving into disbelief and rising panic. The veteran watches, unmoved, as the officer is led out, his once smug expression replaced by one of dawning horror, as though he's finally grasped the gravity of what he's done. The patrons in the bar exchange looks of astonishment, the reality of the moment sinking in. The officer who had walked in with an air of superiority, intent on humiliating an old man, is now the one facing humiliation and judgment. But even as he's led away, he keeps glancing over his shoulder at the veteran, as if trying to understand how this quiet, unassuming man had managed to turn the tables so completely, so effortlessly. The bar remains silent, the air thick with the weight of what just transpired. And as the doors swing shut behind them, there's only one question left on everyone's mind: who exactly is this old man, and what power does he truly hold? At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. Our stories reflect the resilience, strength, and justice that everyone deserves, especially in the face of unfair treatment. To our Black audience and all who support equality, know that you are seen, valued, and respected. We are committed to sharing stories that shine a light on dignity, courage, and the power of truth. Thank you for watching, and we hope this story resonates with you. Please subscribe to our channel to support more stories that matter. Enjoy the story. The old bar, situated on a forgotten street corner in a town that had seen better days, seemed to breathe history with every creak of its wooden floors. Faded posters hung on the walls, remnants of past events no one could quite remember, and the scent of aged oak mingled with the faint smell of spilled beer, both well-worn and comfortable. This was the kind of place that welcomed those looking for a bit of solitude or conversation, a haven for regulars, and a temporary escape for strangers passing through. It wasn't just a bar, it was an unspoken meeting ground for memories and stories, a space where the world outside could be kept at bay, if only for a while. On this particular evening, the bar was quiet, the usual hum of conversation softened as the few patrons kept to themselves. Behind the counter, wiping down glasses with the care of someone who's been there too long to rush, was Tom, the bartender and the unofficial guardian of the establishment. He was a man of few words, with silvered hair and a gaze that spoke of things he'd seen and wouldn't share. Tonight, his focus was on a man seated at the counter, an older black man with a steady, unwavering presence, as though he were rooted in place despite the years that had weathered his body. This man, known simply as Walter, had the air of someone who had once stood on the front lines. His back was straight, shoulders broad, and his hands, though calloused, held his beer glass gently. He wore a brown jacket, frayed at the edges but carefully mended, and a quiet expression that radiated both dignity and reserve. People knew he was a veteran, though he rarely spoke of it. The stories hung around him like an aura. The only hint to his past were the faint scars that traced his hands and the medals he occasionally wore on his jacket, subtle reminders of battles fought long ago. In his silence, he seemed to carry the weight of things few could understand, his eyes holding a depth that often made others hesitate to approach him. Walter was respected by those who knew him, not because he asked for it, but because of how he carried himself, proud, yet humble. He didn't drink much, just enough to enjoy the taste and ease his mind. To Tom and the others, he was a man who had given everything in service to his country, a man who had left pieces of himself scattered across distant lands and had returned with only memories to keep him company. On occasion, he'd share a story or two about his days overseas, his voice quiet but filled with an intensity that hinted at what he didn't say. There was a calm strength in him, a resilience that was apparent even in his silence. But tonight, the quiet comfort of the bar would be disrupted. As Walter nursed his beer, a sense of tranquility surrounding him, the door swung open with a force that drew all eyes to the entrance. Standing there, framed by the dim light filtering in from outside, was Officer Raymond Callahan. Young, brash, and unmistakably arrogant, Callahan was the kind of man who thrived on authority, using his badge as a means of control rather than protection. He was tall, with a square jaw and an expression that seemed permanently etched with disdain. He wore his police uniform like armor, always ready to remind people of his power if they dared question him. Raymond had built a reputation in the town, though not one of respect. He was feared, tolerated, but rarely liked. People saw him as a man quick to anger, someone who looked for reasons to assert his dominance, especially over those he saw as weaker or different. His record was dotted with complaints that mysteriously vanished from the files, thanks to connections within the department. He was untouchable in his mind, a figure of authority with no one daring to hold him accountable. Tonight, as he strode into the bar, there was a smugness in his demeanor, a self-satisfied smirk that suggested he was looking for someone to put in their place. His eyes scanned the room, locking on to Walter almost immediately. Something about the older man's calm, self-assured presence seemed to provoke Raymond, as if Walter's quiet dignity were an affront to his unchecked power. Without hesitation, Raymond made his way to the counter, his heavy steps breaking the stillness of the bar. A few of the patrons exchanged nervous glances, sensing the tension that had suddenly filled the room, but no one spoke up. They were used to Raymond's intimidation tactics, each of them keenly aware of the consequences of crossing him. As he approached Walter, Raymond's smirk grew, his eyes narrowing with a look of superiority. He leaned against the counter, his posture relaxed but charged with aggression. Well, if it isn't the town's resident war hero," he sneered, his voice laced with mockery. Walter barely looked up, his focus still on his drink, his face unreadable. But the officer was undeterred, enjoying the power he felt over the silent man before him. "Do they even give out medals for what you did, old man? Or were you just another body to fill the ranks?" The insult hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Walter remained silent, his face a mask of calm, but his knuckles whitened slightly as he gripped his glass. Tom shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, his eyes darting from Walter to Raymond, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. The other patrons pretended not to hear, their gazes fixed on their drinks, each one unwilling to become the target of Raymond's ire. But Raymond was looking for a reaction, pushing further, his voice growing louder as he leaned closer. "What's the matter? Too proud to speak up? Or maybe you're just afraid to admit that all your glory days mean nothing now?" He let out a low chuckle, clearly enjoying the discomfort radiating from the others in the room. "I mean, what good are medals and memories when you're just another washed-up vet sitting in a bar?" Finally, Walter lifted his gaze, his eyes meeting Raymond's with a quiet, unflinching intensity. There was no anger, no defensiveness, only a calm strength that seemed to catch Raymond off guard. But it wasn't enough to deter him. In fact, it only seemed to embolden him. He straightened, his smirk widening as he picked up a beer bottle from the counter, giving it a casual twirl in his hand. Maybe you need a reminder of who's in charge here, Raymond said, his tone laced with a dangerous edge. He tilted the bottle, as though weighing his next move, his gaze daring Walter to respond. But Walter's face remained impassive, his eyes unwavering, as if he were staring into a storm and refusing to back down. It was a look that made Raymond falter, his bravado slipping just slightly, but only for a moment. Without warning, Raymond raised the bottle, his arm poised to bring it down in an act of sheer intimidation. The patrons around them held their breath, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and shock. But in that split second, Walter moved, his reflexes swift and precise, a lifetime of training coming back to him in an instant. With a fluid motion, he sidestepped, causing Raymond to stumble forward, thrown off balance by his own aggression. The moment hung heavy in the air, a charged silence filling the room as Raymond regained his footing, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. He straightened, glaring at Walter, who had resumed his position, calm and unshaken. Raymond's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched as he realized that he had not only failed to intimidate the older man but had been made to look foolish in front of everyone. The tension in the room was palpable, the silent defiance in Walter's gaze a clear challenge that Raymond couldn't ignore. But instead of retaliating physically, Walter reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, well-worn phone. Raymond watched, his confusion evident as Walter pressed a few buttons, making a calm, quiet call. His voice was low, steady, and though the words weren't audible to those around him, there was a certainty, a quiet authority in his tone that made Raymond uneasy. Within minutes, the unmistakable sound of approaching sirens broke the silence, growing louder as they drew near. Raymond's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, then panic, as he realized that the situation was no longer under his control. The patrons exchanged glances, their initial shock giving way to a sense of anticipation as they watched the scene unfold. As the doors to the bar swung open, two officers stepped inside, their expressions unreadable as they approached Raymond. There was a brief, tense exchange, the lead officer nodding towards Walter with a respect that was clearly out of place for a man sitting alone in a bar. Raymond's face turned pale as he glanced between them, understanding dawning slowly, his confidence crumbling as the lead officer's hand rested on his shoulder, firm but unyielding. The patrons watched in stunned silence as Raymond was led outside, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by a look of disbelief and fear. Walter remained seated, his gaze steady as he watched the officer's departure, a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. And as the bar returned to its familiar silence, those around him were left wondering just who Walter truly was, and what kind of power he held in his quiet strength. The next day, Walter returned to the bar, his quiet presence filling the same seat as if nothing had happened the night before. Yet, there was an unmistakable shift in the air. The patrons who had witnessed the altercation exchanged glances, whispers circulating among them, some tinged with admiration, others with worry. The scene had spread throughout the town like wildfire, an old war hero standing up against the local officer known for his arrogance. People couldn't stop talking about it, questioning who exactly Walter was and how he'd managed to turn the tables on someone who seemed untouchable. Behind the bar, Tom cleaned glasses with an intensity that betrayed his nervousness. He was relieved that Walter had returned unharmed, but he knew that Raymond wouldn't let this slide easily. The officer had a reputation for holding grudges, and Tom feared that he would come back with a vengeance, more determined than ever to prove his dominance. As Walter sipped his beer, a sense of calm radiating from him, Tom leaned over, his voice low and cautious. "Walter," he began, choosing his words carefully, "are you sure you know what you're doing?" "Raymond, he's not one to forget something like this." Walter glanced at Tom, a faint smile on his lips. "I've faced bigger threats than a badge and a loud mouth," he replied evenly. His voice held a quiet confidence, as though he were talking about a minor inconvenience rather than a serious threat. But Tom shook his head, his concern evident. "This isn't just about last night, Walter. You embarrassed him, humiliated him, really. And a guy like Raymond? He'll be back. People like him, they don't handle losing power well." Tom's words hung in the air, and for a moment, Walter's gaze shifted, a shadow passing over his face as he considered the bartender's warning. But then he straightened, the calm resolve returning. "I'm not here to make trouble, Tom," Walter said softly, his tone reassuring. "But I won't be disrespected in my own town, not by someone who should be protecting the people, not intimidating them." Tom nodded, understanding Walter's pride, his sense of dignity that refused to bend. But he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered, knowing all too well how far Raymond was willing to go to restore his sense of superiority. Later that evening, as Walter made his way home along the quiet streets, he sensed someone following him. He didn't look back. Years of training had taught him that a predator often thrives on the fear they see in their prey. Instead, he kept his stride steady, his eyes focused ahead, ears tuned to the faint sound of footsteps trailing him. When he reached a secluded stretch of road, he paused, turning slowly. Standing a few yards away was Raymond, his face a twisted mask of anger and frustration. "Well, if it isn't our local hero," Raymond sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Out for a late-night stroll? Or are you just trying to prove something?" Walter met his gaze with calm, his expression unyielding. "I'm just walking home, officer," he replied evenly, refusing to rise to the bait. Raymond took a step closer, his posture aggressive. "Do you think you're some kind of legend, huh? Think you can just walk around, throwing your weight around, making a fool of me?" "I didn't make a fool of anyone, Raymond," Walter replied, his voice steady but firm. "You did that all by yourself. You had a choice." The word struck a nerve, and Raymond's face twisted with rage. "You think you're untouchable because of a few friends in high places? You're nothing but an old man clinging to a past that doesn't matter anymore," he spat, his voice shaking with fury. "And I can make sure you remember that." Walter held his ground, his gaze unwavering. "Respect isn't given, Raymond. It's earned. Maybe that's why you have to intimidate people to get them to listen to you." Raymond's fists clenched, his knuckles white against the dim light of the street lamp overhead. But before he could respond, the sound of a car approaching drew both their attention. The vehicle slowed to a stop, and the window rolled down, revealing a familiar face, a fellow veteran, someone who had served alongside Walter years ago and still held immense respect for him. "Everything all right here, Walter?" the man asked, his gaze flicking between Walter and Raymond with a wary look. Walter nodded, though he didn't break eye contact with Raymond. "Just a difference of opinion," he replied calmly, though his tone held an unmistakable edge. The presence of another witness seemed to unsettle Raymond, and he took a step back, his confidence faltering. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice low enough that only Walter could hear. "I'll make sure you regret this." Walter watched him retreat, the threat hanging in the air, but he showed no sign of fear or worry. Instead, he turned to his friend, giving him a grateful nod. "Thanks for showing up," he said quietly. The man nodded, understanding the unspoken message. "You've got more friends here than you know, Walter. Just let us know if you need anything." As he watched his friend drive off, Walter felt a sense of solidarity, a reassurance that he was not alone. But he also knew that Raymond's words were more than empty threats. The officer's wounded pride would drive him to desperate measures, and Walter needed to be prepared. The following days brought a tense calm, an uneasy truce as Raymond kept a low profile, though his presence lingered like a dark cloud over the town. Walter continued his routine, returning to the bar, sharing quiet conversations with Tom and the regular patrons. But beneath the surface, he remained vigilant, knowing that Raymond was watching, waiting for an opportunity to strike. One evening, as Walter sat at the counter, he noticed a young woman enter the bar, her face pale and anxious as she glanced around nervously. She caught sight of Walter and approached, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. Are you Walter?" she asked, her voice trembling. He nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "That's me. What can I do for you?" The woman hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "My name is Sarah," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm Raymond's sister." Walter's eyes narrowed, but he kept his expression neutral, allowing her to continue. "I know he's been causing trouble for you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I'm sorry. I don't know how to stop him. He's not the man he used to be." Her words trembled, filled with a mixture of shame and helplessness. Walter listened quietly, sensing the pain in her voice. "What happened to him?" he asked gently, his tone compassionate. She looked down, her hands twisting together as she struggled to find the words. "He's always been angry. But it got worse after he joined the force. He thinks the badge gives him power. That he can control people, make them fear him." She paused, a tear slipping down her cheek. "He used to be different, Walter. Before everything changed." Walter nodded, understanding the weight of her words, the pain of watching someone lose themselves to anger and pride. "It's hard to watch someone you love become something they're not," he said softly. She looked up, her eyes filled with gratitude for his understanding. "Please, if there's anything you can do to help him, to show him that this path he's on is wrong," her voice broke, and she covered her mouth, struggling to hold back tears. I just don't want to lose him." Walter placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his expression kind. "I'll do what I can, Sarah. Sometimes, people need a reminder of who they really are." As she left, Walter felt the weight of her request settling on him, the responsibility of trying to bring Raymond back from the edge. But he also knew that the officer's path was one of his own choosing, a road he had to want to leave. And if Raymond refused to change, then justice would have to take its course. The next day, Walter walked to the police station, his stride purposeful, his gaze steady as he approached the imposing building. He had a quiet conversation with the precinct chief, a man who respected Walter's service and understood the situation. The chief nodded gravely, listening as Walter spoke of Raymond's behavior, his warnings tempered with the hope that Raymond might choose a better path. But even as they spoke, Raymond watched from a distance, his eyes dark with resentment as he realized Walter's intentions. The sight of the older man, calm and resolute, discussing him with the chief felt like a betrayal, igniting a fury that burned away any remaining reason. That night, as Walter returned home, he sensed Raymond's presence, the officer lurking in the shadows, his anger barely restrained. There was a desperation in Raymond's eyes, a fierce determination that seemed to drive him beyond reason. And in that moment, Walter knew that there would be no peaceful resolution, no redemption for the man who had let anger consume him. Raymond stepped forward, his expression twisted with hatred, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "You think you can take me down, old man? You think you're some kind of hero?" His words were filled with contempt, each syllable dripping with malice. Walter met his gaze, calm but unwavering, his silence a challenge that only deepened Raymond's rage. The tension hung thick in the air, the weight of unspoken threats pressing down as they stood face to face, each one refusing to back down. And as the night stretched on, the anticipation grew, a sense of inevitability settling over them both. The town lay silent around them, unaware of the storm brewing, of the confrontation that would soon reach its breaking point. In that moment, the final showdown between them seemed inevitable, the long simmering feud about to come to a head. In the stillness of the night, the tension between Walter and Raymond reached a breaking point. The darkened street was silent, save for the quiet hum of crickets in the nearby brush, as they stood face to face in a confrontation that had been simmering since their first clash. Walter's gaze was calm, measured, his posture straight, while Raymond's was anything but. The young officer's face was twisted with frustration, resentment boiling just beneath the surface as he stared down the man who dared to defy him. "You think you're something special, don't you?" Raymond's voice was low, barely more than a growl, but there was a venom to it, an edge that spoke of the anger roiling within. "Just because you've got a few medals and some friends who owe you favors, you think you can walk around here like you own the place? Walter met his gaze, his expression unchanging. No one owns this place, Raymond, he replied, his tone steady but firm. But respect isn't something you get by demanding it. You have to earn it. Earn it? Raymond let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as though he couldn't believe what he was hearing. You think you're better than me, don't you? Sitting there with that holier-than-thou attitude, looking down on me like I'm beneath you. I never said I was better than anyone, Walter replied quietly. But I know what it means to serve, to protect others. It's not about power or control. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Raymond scoffed, his hand twitching at his side, as if he wanted to reach for something but was restraining himself. Spare me the lecture, old man. I've heard enough of your self-righteous nonsense. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You think anyone cares about some washed-up vet and his sad little stories? No one cares, Walter. People look at you, and all they see is a relic. A reminder of things they'd rather forget. Walter's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his composure, his gaze unwavering. Maybe that's true for you, Raymond. But I'm not here to make you understand. I'm here because people like you don't deserve the power you've been given. You use it to intimidate, to push others down, instead of lifting them up. That's not what a real officer does. Raymond's eyes flashed with fury, his control slipping as his voice rose. You don't know anything about me. You don't know the first thing about what it takes to do this job, to survive out here. He was shouting now, the words spilling out as though he'd been holding them back for too long. You walk around with your head held high, pretending you're some kind of hero, but you're just a washed-up nobody, clinging to a past that doesn't matter anymore. Walter held his gaze, the weight of Raymond's anger crashing over him, but he remained steady, grounded. He knew that Raymond's words were born out of his own insecurities, his need to feel powerful, but he also knew that there was a point where words would no longer be enough. Raymond, Walter said quietly, his voice steady, but with a hint of warning, there's still a way back for you. You don't have to go down this road. But Raymond was beyond reason, his anger blinding him to anything but his need to prove himself. He took another step forward, his posture aggressive, his hand twitching at his side. You don't get to tell me what to do, he hissed. You're nothing. Just an old man trying to relive his glory days. Walter's gaze didn't waver, but he could see that Raymond was past the point of listening. The young officer's hand moved, reaching for something at his waist, but before he could act, the sound of approaching footsteps broke through the tension. Both men turned, startled, as a small group of people appeared at the edge of the street, their faces familiar in the dim light. It was a group of Walter's old friends, veterans who had served alongside him, men who knew his story, who understood the weight of the years he carried. They had come, quietly, sensing that something was brewing, drawn by the unspoken bond that had held them together through battles far more dangerous than this. Raymond's face twisted with a mixture of anger and fear as he realized he was now outnumbered. What's this? He sneered, his voice laced with contempt. A little reunion? You think these guys can protect you? One of the men, a tall, grizzled veteran with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, his voice calm but unyielding. We're not here to protect anyone, Officer Callahan. We're here to bear witness. To make sure that whatever happens next is seen, remembered. Raymond's sneer faltered, his eyes darting between the men, uncertainty flickering in his gaze. But his anger quickly resurfaced, and he straightened, as though determined not to be intimidated. I don't need an audience, he spat. This is between me and him. Walter's friend shook his head, his expression resolute. No, Raymond. When you threaten one of us, you threaten all of us. We've fought together, bled together, and will stand together now. Raymond let out a frustrated growl, his hand clenching at his side, but he knew he was outmatched. His gaze shifted back to Walter, filled with a mix of anger and desperation. You think this changes anything? He demanded, his voice shaking slightly. You think you've won just because you've got a bunch of old soldiers standing behind you? Walter didn't respond immediately, his gaze steady as he looked at the man who had become his enemy, a man consumed by his need for control, his inability to understand the true meaning of service. This isn't about winning or losing, Raymond, he said quietly. It's about what's right. It's about standing up for something bigger than ourselves. Raymond stared at him, his face flushed with anger, but there was a flicker of something else there too, doubt, uncertainty, perhaps even a sliver of shame. For a brief moment, it looked as though he might back down, as though he might see the truth in Walter's words. But then, his pride took over, pushing aside any lingering hesitation. With a snarl, he took a step forward, his hand reaching out as if to grab Walter, but before he could act, a new voice cut through the night, calm but commanding. "That's enough, Officer Callahan." The group turned, and there, standing at the edge of the street, was the police chief himself, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene before him. He looked from Raymond to Walter, his gaze lingering on the group of veterans who stood silently behind their friend. Raymond's face drained of color, his posture stiffening as he realized the gravity of the situation. "Chief." The chief held up a hand, silencing him. "I know what you were doing, Raymond. I've been hearing about it for a while now." His voice was calm, but there was a weight to it, a quiet authority that left no room for argument. "This stops here." Raymond's face contorted with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You're just going to take his word over mine? An old man's word against a cop?" The chief's gaze hardened, and he took a step closer, his voice low but firm. "This isn't about his word, Raymond. It's about your actions. Your abuse of power. Your disregard for the people you're supposed to serve." He glanced at the group of veterans, his expression somber. "And it's about respecting those who've given more for this country than you can even begin to understand." For a moment, the street was silent, the weight of the chief's words settling over them all. Raymond looked as though he might argue, his face twisted with rage, but there was no room left for defiance. He was cornered, stripped of the power he had wielded so carelessly, so ruthlessly. And in that moment, he seemed to realize just how far he had fallen, just how much he had lost in his pursuit of control. Walter watched him, his expression filled with a quiet sadness. He had wanted to give Raymond a chance, to show him that there was still a way back, but he knew now that the young man's pride had sealed his fate. There would be no redemption, no reconciliation. Only consequences. The chief turned to Walter, his expression softening as he nodded in acknowledgement. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Walter. Men like you remind us what true service looks like." Walter inclined his head, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you, Chief. Sometimes, standing up for what's right is the hardest thing we can do." The chief's gaze shifted back to Raymond, his expression hardening once more. "Officer Callahan, as of this moment, you're suspended pending investigation. Hand over your badge and gun." Raymond's face went pale, his hands shaking as he reached for his badge, his entire world crumbling around him. He glanced at Walter one last time, his expression a mix of anger, humiliation, and something else, a hint of regret, perhaps, or the realization of the path he had chosen. With one last bitter glare, he handed over his badge, his hands clenched at his sides as he turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy with the weight of his own choices. The group watched him go, a collective sense of relief settling over them, though there was an unspoken sadness, a recognition of what might have been had Raymond chosen a different path. Walter turned to his friends, his expression weary but resolute. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. "For standing with me." The scarred veteran who had spoken earlier stepped forward, clapping a hand on Walter's shoulder. "We wouldn't have been anywhere else, Walter. You'd have done the same for any of us." The chief nodded, his expression thoughtful. "This town owes you a debt, Walter. And I want you to know that as long as I'm here, men like Raymond won't be allowed to tarnish the badge." Walter looked at him, his expression filled with gratitude and a quiet pride. "Thank you, Chief. That means a lot." As the group began to disperse, Walter stood alone for a moment, the weight of the night settling over him. He looked up at the stars, a sense of peace washing over him as he realized that, at least for now, justice had been served. The night felt heavy with the aftershock of everything that had transpired. Raymond had stormed off into the darkness, his footsteps echoing on the empty street as he disappeared from sight, his pride and authority shattered in front of everyone he once intimidated. But Walter wasn't left with a sense of victory. There was no triumph in seeing a man stripped of his dignity, even one who had so often abused his power. He stood there a while, quietly taking in the events, the faces of his friends, each one carrying a mixture of relief and sadness, as they too seemed to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Walter's longtime friend, Henry, who had spoken up in defense, lingered by his side. The lines on his face deepened as he looked at Walter with a thoughtful gaze, his voice soft and steady. "Walter," he began, his tone carrying both respect and a hint of hesitation, "you did what had to be done tonight. You know that, don't you?" Walter sighed, his gaze fixed on the empty street where Raymond had stood just moments ago. "Maybe, Henry," he replied quietly, a hint of sadness in his voice. "But it's hard to feel good about it. It's hard to see someone fall, even when you know they dug the hole themselves." Henry nodded slowly, understanding. "That's because you're a man of honor, Walter. And a man of honor never takes pleasure in another man's downfall. You gave him every chance to do the right thing, and he chose not to." Walter looked at Henry, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and melancholy. "It's not just him I'm thinking about," he admitted. "His sister, Sarah, she came to me. She wanted me to help him, to show him that there's still a way back. I don't know if I did that tonight." Henry's brow furrowed, his expression turning serious. "Walter, you can't save a man who doesn't want to be saved. You offered him a choice, you showed him a better path, but he turned away. That's on him, not on you." Walter nodded, though the sadness in his eyes lingered. He knew Henry was right, but the weight of it still hung heavy on him. He thought of Sarah, of the hope in her eyes when she'd come to him, asking him to help her brother find his way back. He'd wanted to fulfill that hope, to find a way to reach Raymond, but now it seemed that the young officer's pride and anger had built walls too high for anyone to break through. As they stood there, lost in thought, a quiet voice broke the silence. "Walter." They turned to see Sarah standing at the edge of the street, her face pale and anxious. She had watched from a distance, hoping, perhaps, that things would resolve peacefully, that her brother might see reason. But now she looked at Walter, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear, as though searching his face for some sign that things weren't as bad as they seemed. Is he all right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but the tremor in her tone betrayed her worry. Walter hesitated, the weight of her question pressing on him. "He's angry," he replied gently, choosing his words carefully. "I tried to talk to him, to show him that there's another way, but he wasn't ready to listen." Sarah's face fell, her shoulders slumping as the reality of it settled over her. "I was afraid of that," she murmured, her voice laced with a sorrow that was all too familiar to Walter. "He's been lost for so long, Walter. I thought maybe you could be the one to help him see reason. To bring him back." Walter reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I wanted to help him. I tried. But he has to be willing to change. Until he's ready to let go of his anger, there's nothing anyone can do." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and nodded slowly, accepting the truth she tried so hard to avoid. "Thank you, Walter. I know you did what you could. I don't know how to help him anymore." Henry, who had been standing quietly by their side, spoke up, his voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes, the best way to help someone is to step back and let them find their own way. You've been there for him, Sarah, but now he has to face the consequences of his choices. Maybe, one day, he'll understand what he's lost, and he'll come back. Sarah gave a small, sad smile, though the sorrow in her eyes remained. I hope so, she whispered. For his sake, I hope so. They stood there for a moment, a quiet understanding passing between them, a shared sense of loss and acceptance. Sarah glanced at Walter one last time, her gaze filled with gratitude and sorrow, before turning and walking away, her figure disappearing into the night. As Walter watched her go, he felt a surge of conflicting emotions, relief, sadness, and a lingering sense of responsibility that weighed heavily on him. He turned to Henry, his expression thoughtful. I didn't want it to end like this, he said quietly. I wanted to find a way to reach him, to make him see that there's more to life than power and control. Henry placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, his voice filled with understanding. You did what you could, Walter. You gave him a chance. Now it's up to him. Walter nodded, though the weight of it still hung heavy on his heart. He had fought battles, seen friends fall, faced enemies who were ruthless and unyielding. But somehow, this felt different. This wasn't a battle he could win with strength or strategy. It was a struggle of the heart, of trying to reach a man lost to his own anger and pride. As they made their way back to the bar, the quiet settled over them once more, the sounds of the night filling the silence. But just as they were about to part ways, a voice called out from behind them, startling them both. Walter. They turned to see Raymond standing there, his face flushed with anger, his eyes filled with a fierce determination that sent a chill down Walter's spine. It was as though he had returned, unwilling to let go, unwilling to accept what had happened. Raymond, Walter said, his voice steady but cautious, this isn't the way. But Raymond shook his head, his fists clenched at his sides, his face twisted with a mixture of rage and despair. You think you can just walk away after humiliating me? After taking everything I've worked for? Walter held up his hands in a calming gesture, his voice filled with quiet strength. Raymond, I didn't take anything from you. You did that yourself. You made your choices, and now you have to live with the consequences. Raymond took a step closer, his voice trembling with barely restrained fury. You don't understand. You can't understand what it's like to be looked down on, to be seen as nothing. Walter's expression softened, a flicker of empathy in his gaze. I do understand, Raymond. I know what it feels like to be underestimated, to be seen as less than. But that doesn't give you the right to hurt others, to use your power to make people fear you. Raymond's gaze faltered, the word striking a chord deep within him, though he tried to hide it. I was trying to be someone, he muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. Walter took a step closer, his gaze steady and compassionate. You are someone, Raymond. But it's not about the power, or the badge, or making people fear you. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. That's what real strength looks like. For a moment, Raymond seemed to waver, his anger giving way to something else, a flicker of vulnerability, of understanding. But then his pride resurfaced, the wall he had built around himself too strong to break. No, he spat, his voice hardening once more. You don't get to lecture me. You don't get to act like you're better than me. Walter sighed, a look of sadness passing over his face. I'm not better than you, Raymond. I'm just trying to show you that there's another way. But if you're not ready to see it, there's nothing more I can do. Raymond's face twisted with frustration, his fists clenching at his sides as he fought to contain his anger. But as he looked at Walter, something in his gaze softened, a flicker of regret that he quickly tried to hide. I don't need your pity, he muttered, his voice filled with bitterness. I don't need anything from you. Walter nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. I know. But if you ever change your mind, if you ever decide that you want to find a different path, I'll be here. With that, he turned, leaving Raymond standing there, alone in the darkness, his face a mixture of anger and confusion, his pride and fear battling within him. Walter walked away, his heart heavy but resolute, knowing that he had done all he could, that he had offered a chance for redemption, even if Raymond wasn't ready to take it. As he walked, the weight of the night settled over him, but there was a quiet peace in his heart, a sense of closure that came from knowing he had done the right thing, that he had stood up for what he believed in. And though Raymond's path remained uncertain, Walter knew that he had given him a choice, a chance to find his way back, if he was ever willing to take it. In the end, that was all he could do, offer a hand, an open door, a way out of the darkness. The rest was up to Raymond. Walter returned to the quiet of his small home, the events of the night lingering in his mind, weaving through his thoughts with a heaviness that even his years of experience couldn't easily shake off. He sat down slowly, the weariness of age and conflict settling over him, yet there was a deep-seated calm within, a sense of clarity that he hadn't felt in some time. This wasn't the battlefield he'd once known, but in its own way, it had been just as intense, a clash of values, of pride, and the quiet strength needed to stand one's ground. He couldn't shake the image of Raymond's face, the anger in his eyes giving way, for just a flicker, to something else, confusion, maybe even a glimpse of understanding, before the mask of resentment had snapped back into place. As he poured himself a glass of water, he thought about the consequences that would inevitably unfold from that night. Raymond's suspension was only the beginning. The chief, having witnessed the confrontation and knowing Walter's integrity, would likely push for a full investigation into Raymond's conduct. There was more at stake than the bruised ego of a young officer. It was about the trust the community had placed in the force to protect them, not intimidate them. Walter knew this was a wound that would take time to heal, if it ever did. But healing wasn't always gentle. Sometimes it required painful truths and difficult choices. The next morning, Walter woke to a knock at his door. It was early, the sun barely cresting the horizon, casting a soft, tentative light across the quiet town. He opened the door to find the police chief standing there, his face lined with exhaustion but carrying a somber determination. "Chief," Walter greeted, a note of surprise in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you so soon." The chief gave a slight nod, his gaze serious. "I wanted to talk to you in person, Walter. May I come in?" Walter stepped aside, allowing him to enter, and led him to the small living room where they sat across from each other, the silence heavy as the chief gathered his thoughts. "Walter," the chief began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of what was to come. "Last night. I've been thinking about it. About what it all means, and what we have to do moving forward." He paused, looking at Walter with a mixture of respect and regret. "I'm not sure you understand just how deep this issue goes. Raymond, he's not the only one." Walter's brows knitted together as he processed the words, a chill settling over him. "What do you mean, Chief?" The chief's gaze hardened, his voice low and serious. "There's a culture that's been growing in our department, one that's gone unchecked for too long. Raymond isn't the only officer who's let the badge go to his head, who's used his authority to intimidate rather than protect. We've got a problem, Walter. And last night only scratched the surface." A silence filled the room, thick with the weight of the truth that had just been spoken. Walter felt a familiar resolve settle over him, the same sense of duty that had guided him through his years of service. He looked at the chief, understanding the unspoken request that lay between them. "So, what do we do?" Walter asked, his voice steady, though he felt the gravity of the task before them. The chief leaned forward, his expression grim but determined. "I need you, Walter. The town needs you. They trust you, they respect you, and frankly, there are a lot of people who would speak up if they knew you were with us. You have connections, people who would listen if you called on them. We need to root out this culture of intimidation, to hold the department accountable, and to rebuild trust with the community." Walter's gaze was intense, unwavering. He understood what the chief was asking, and he knew the weight of it. It wasn't just about Raymond anymore, it was about the whole town, about the promise of safety and protection that had been broken for too long. "Chief," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I'll stand with you on this. But you know this won't be easy. There will be pushback, and there are those who won't take kindly to a man like me challenging the system." The chief nodded, his expression resolute. "I know. But I also know that if anyone can do it, it's you." Walter took a deep breath, feeling the enormity of the task settle over him. But this was his home, his community, and he wasn't going to stand by while it was torn apart by those who should have been its protectors. The days that followed were filled with quiet but determined action. Walter reached out to the people he'd served with, to those he trusted in positions of influence, calling on them not just for support but for guidance. He knew that dismantling the culture within the department would take more than just words, it would take a community effort, a unified front willing to stand against the fear and intimidation that had settled over the town. Meanwhile, Raymond's suspension turned into an investigation, one that quickly revealed a pattern of abuse and misconduct that extended beyond him. Reports surfaced from citizens who had once been too afraid to speak up, their stories painting a picture of a department that had, for too long, turned a blind eye to the actions of its officers. Walter's presence became a symbol of hope, reminder that justice wasn't an unreachable ideal but a goal worth fighting for. He held meetings with community leaders, with families who had been affected by the intimidation and fear, listening to their stories, understanding their pain, and sharing in their hope for a better future. One evening, as he prepared to speak at a town hall meeting, Walter caught sight of Sarah standing at the back of the room, her face drawn with worry and sadness. He approached her quietly, his voice gentle as he greeted her. "Sarah," he said softly, his gaze filled with understanding. "Thank you for coming." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "Walter. I didn't know. I didn't realize how deep it went." He nodded, a sadness in his gaze. "None of us did, Sarah. Sometimes, these things hide in plain sight until someone's willing to shine a light on them." She hesitated, her voice breaking slightly as she spoke. Is there any way back for Raymond? Is there any chance he could change?" Walter's expression softened, a flicker of compassion in his eyes. "People can change, Sarah. But they have to want it. They have to be willing to look at themselves, to understand the harm they've caused, and to take responsibility. That's not something anyone else can do for him." She nodded slowly, understanding the truth of his words, though her heart ached at the reality of it. I just want him to find his way. To be the man he could be, instead of the man he's become." Walter placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his voice filled with quiet strength. "Sometimes, people have to lose everything to see what they truly need. Maybe this will be the wake-up call he needs." The meeting that night was filled with emotion, with people sharing their experiences, their hopes for change, and their gratitude for those willing to stand up and fight for justice. Walter listened, spoke when needed, and offered a steady presence that reassured the community. But as he looked out over the crowd, he couldn't shake the feeling of sadness that lingered, the knowledge that the journey ahead would be long and difficult, and that not everyone would be willing to change. A few days later, Walter received a message from the police chief, asking him to come down to the station. He arrived, greeted by a sense of tension that filled the building, as officers and staff members looked at him with a mixture of respect and unease. Walter's presence had become a catalyst for change, and everyone knew it. The chief greeted him with a firm handshake, his expression serious. "Walter, thank you for coming. There's something I wanted you to see." He led Walter to a small room where a familiar figure sat, his posture slumped, his face filled with bitterness and resignation. It was Raymond. The chief glanced at Walter, a silent question in his gaze, and Walter nodded, understanding. The chief stepped back, leaving the two men alone. Walter took a seat across from Raymond, his gaze steady as he waited, giving the young officer a chance to speak. After a long moment, Raymond finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and shame. You must be pretty proud of yourself, he muttered, his voice laced with bitterness. Walter shook his head, his expression calm but firm. This isn't about pride, Raymond. It's about justice. It's about right and wrong. Raymond scoffed, his face twisting with resentment. Easy for you to say. You come in here, stirring things up, making everyone think you're some kind of hero. Walter's gaze softened, a hint of sadness in his eyes. I'm not a hero, Raymond. I'm just a man trying to do what's right. The question is, what kind of man do you want to be? Raymond's face darkened, his fists clenched as he looked away, refusing to meet Walter's gaze. I don't need a lecture from you. Walter let the silence settle, allowing Raymond to feel the weight of his words. This isn't about me, Raymond. It's about you. About the choices you've made and the consequences you're facing. You have a chance here, a chance to take responsibility, to change. But only if you're willing to look at yourself honestly. Raymond's jaw tightened, his face a mask of defiance. But beneath the anger, Walter could see the flicker of something else, a hint of fear, of vulnerability that he was desperately trying to hide. Why do you even care? Raymond muttered, his voice barely audible. Why don't you just let me fall? Walter's voice softened, filled with compassion. Because no one is beyond redemption, Raymond. But redemption isn't something that's given. It's earned. And it starts with a choice. The room fell silent, the weight of Walter's words hanging in the air as Raymond sat there, his face filled with conflict, as though he were battling a storm within himself. In the quiet aftermath of everything that had happened, the town slowly began to rebuild. People had seen truths that couldn't be ignored, and those truths left a mark. For Walter, the days were filled with conversations, handshakes, and quiet gratitude from people who saw him not as a hero but as a neighbor, a friend who had stood up for what was right when it would have been easier to stay silent. His life returned to a simple rhythm, one that allowed him to quietly fade back into the routines of everyday life, yet something in the town was different, a shift in trust, in responsibility. He knew this was only the beginning of lasting change. Raymond, meanwhile, faced the consequences of his actions, not just with the suspension that had now turned into a formal discharge, but also with a kind of isolation that he hadn't expected. The community he had once intimidated now saw him as a cautionary tale. Raymond's choices had put him in a spotlight he never wanted, and with no badge to hide behind, he found himself exposed, vulnerable. Even his family, particularly his sister Sarah, kept their distance, hoping he would come to terms with the consequences, that he would see the harm he'd caused. But there was a moment of grace left for Raymond, a chance to rebuild, however difficult. Walter had planted a seed, and as days turned into weeks, Raymond's anger began to fade, replaced by a quiet, haunting sense of guilt. One evening, he found himself standing on Walter's doorstep, a man who was, for the first time in his life, without excuses, without the armor of authority. He knocked, his heart pounding as he waited for an answer. Walter opened the door, his expression unreadable as he took in the sight of the man who had once been his antagonist. Raymond hesitated, the words caught in his throat, but eventually, he found his voice. I don't expect you to forgive me, Raymond began, his gaze fixed on the ground. But I came here to tell you, you were right. I spent so much time trying to prove I was strong, that I was in control, but I was just, hiding. Walter's expression softened, though he remained silent, allowing Raymond the space to speak. I've done a lot of damage, Walter. To people I was supposed to protect. I don't know if there's any way to fix that, he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. But I want to try. I want to change. For a long moment, Walter said nothing, his gaze steady as he took in the broken man standing before him. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. Change starts with owning what you've done, Raymond. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But if you're willing to put in the work, to face the consequences and learn from them, then there's a way forward. Raymond nodded, his expression filled with a mix of relief and sorrow. "Thank you," he murmured. "For giving me a chance, for not giving up on me." Walter offered a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the difficult journey ahead. "We've all made mistakes, Raymond. The important thing is what you do next." And with that, Raymond left, not entirely forgiven, but given a path to redemption, one that would be long and difficult but one he was finally willing to take. Months passed, and with them, a sense of renewal settled over the town. The police department underwent changes, policies put in place to prevent abuses of power, training programs emphasizing service, respect, and accountability. Walter's influence lingered as a quiet reminder of the standards expected from those entrusted to protect the community. People came to see him as more than just a veteran, more than just a neighbor, they saw him as a guardian, a man who stood for something greater than himself. Walter's life became one of quiet peace. He spent his days helping with community events, lending a hand to neighbors, even offering guidance to young people who sought him out, inspired by the strength he had shown. His home became a place of gathering, of conversations that mattered, and he was content, knowing he had done his part to bring justice and compassion to the place he called home. One afternoon, Sarah visited him, her face carrying a mixture of relief and gratitude. She told him of Raymond's progress, of his work at a rehabilitation center where he now spent his days helping others rebuild their lives. It wasn't an easy road, she admitted, but Raymond was finally finding purpose, a sense of humility that he had never known before. "Thank you, Walter," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You gave him a chance when no one else would. He's not the same man he was, and I don't think he ever will be again." Walter smiled gently, his gaze filled with compassion. "Sometimes, it takes losing everything to find out who we really are, Sarah. I'm glad he's finding his way." As she left, Walter felt a sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he had made a difference, that he had stood for something when it mattered most. His life, though simple, was rich with purpose, filled with the quiet, steady rhythm of a man at peace with himself and his choices. The years went by, and Walter became a beloved figure in the town, a symbol of integrity, of resilience, and of the power of one man's courage to effect change. People would tell his story, pass it down as a lesson in strength and humility, as a reminder of the importance of standing up for what's right. He had shown them that true strength wasn't in power or authority, but in the willingness to hold oneself accountable, to protect those who could not protect themselves. And as for Raymond, his journey continued, each day a step toward rebuilding himself and atoning for the harm he had caused. He became a quiet advocate for change, working behind the scenes, humbled by the lessons he had learned. In time, he found a measure of peace, knowing that his past mistakes did not define him but served as a foundation for a better future. As we come to the end of this story, let's take a moment to reflect on what it means to be truly strong. Walter's story isn't just about one man standing up to injustice, it's about the power of resilience, of choosing integrity over fear, and the courage to face difficult truths. It reminds us that real strength isn't about authority or control, it's about compassion, about the willingness to stand by our values, even when it's not easy. Raymond's journey, too, holds a lesson. It shows that while mistakes can bring us to our knees, they don't have to define us. Redemption is possible, but it requires humility, accountability, and the courage to change. What did you think of Walter's decision to stand up, not only for himself but for his community? Have you ever faced a situation where doing what was right came at a personal cost? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your reflections on this powerful journey of resilience, redemption, and change. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you found it moving or inspiring, please consider subscribing to Tales of Twist for more stories that dig deep into the heart of real, impactful choices. And don't forget to like and share if this story resonated with you. Until next time, keep standing strong and remember, true courage is always worth the fight.